It started on a cold January morning in 2024, when a construction crew in Franklin, Tennessee, was sent to renovate a long-abandoned farmhouse at the edge of town. The air was thick with dust and the faint echo of piano notes that no one could explain. The crew chief, a man named Rick Marlowe, was the first to notice something strange about the old upright piano that stood against the wall of what used to be the living room. Its mahogany was split and warped, one leg broken, and the keys were yellowed from time and humidity. When they tried to move it, something shifted inside, like paper crinkling. Rick reached into the cavity beneath the strings and pulled out a folded, water-stained note. On the front, scrawled in faded blue ink, was a date: March 4th, 2004. The moment the note was discovered, the property manager called the local sheriff's office. Within hours, 2 deputies and a crime scene technician were on site. They didn't expect much. Half the town's old houses had been vandalized or used by squatters at some point. But when Detective Anna Whitaker unfolded the note, the words inside made her stop cold. She was right, it read, but no one listened. Now it's too late. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, almost trembling, and at the bottom, barely legible, was a signature that looked like L. Carver. For the younger deputies, it was just another odd relic in an old house. But Whitaker had been in Franklin long enough to remember the name: Lacey Carver, a 24-year-old music teacher who went missing 20 years earlier after a church recital. Her case had haunted the department for years, resurfacing every few anniversaries when her mother would call, asking if there was anything new. There never was. Now, for the first time in decades, there was. When the forensic team examined the note, they confirmed that the paper and ink were consistent with early 2000s materials. The piano had sat undisturbed since the late 2000s, according to property records. But the most chilling detail wasn't the age. It was what was found hidden deeper inside the piano, a silver locket wedged between 2 strings. Inside was a small photograph of a young woman smiling, holding a sheet of music. Lacey, Summer '03, the caption read. The news traveled fast in Franklin. By evening, local TV stations were broadcasting from the farmhouse. Possible break in 2004 disappearance, the headlines said. For the Carver family, it was both hope and dread. Lacey's mother, Margaret, hadn't left Franklin since her daughter went missing. She was 78 now, her voice frail when she spoke to reporters. They said they'd found something in the house where she used to teach piano lessons. She said softly, "I just hope this time it means something." Detective Whitaker reopened the case file the next morning. The original investigation had gone cold in less than a year. Lacey was last seen leaving the I Methodist Church around 8:30 p.m. after a recital. She told friends she was heading home, but she never made it. Her car, a white Honda Civic, was found parked behind the church the next morning with her purse still inside. No signs of a struggle. No fingerprints other than her own. At the time, suspicion had briefly fallen on the church's maintenance worker, a man named Robert Hensley, who had a prior assault record. But his alibi checked out. He was visiting his sister in Memphis that night. The trail had gone nowhere. As Whitaker flipped through the faded photographs and typed transcripts, she noticed something curious. In several of the old witness statements, people mentioned hearing music late that night coming from the church after the recital ended. Thought it was just her practicing again, one said. She'd stay late sometimes. But the church organ was locked that night, and Lacey's own piano was the one now sitting in the abandoned farmhouse miles away. How did it get there? County records showed the farmhouse had belonged to a retired music teacher named Edna Rowe, who died in 2009. She'd been one of Lacey's mentors growing up, even giving her the piano as a graduation gift. But Rowe's nephew had sold most of her belongings at an estate auction years later. Somewhere in that shuffle, the piano ended up in storage, until the new owners bought the property last year and moved it back into the house. Whitaker began retracing those steps, contacting the auction company, the storage facility, and the family who last owned the property. Most didn't remember much until she reached a man named Kyle Denton, who'd helped haul the piano into the farmhouse in 2010. "I do remember one thing," he said over the phone. "That thing was heavy as hell. We took the back off to make it lighter, and there was something inside, like a cloth or paper. I didn't look close. We just put it back together." That something might have been the note. Whitaker's instincts told her this was more than coincidence. So she reached out to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for assistance. The note and locket were sent for forensic testing. Within days, the lab confirmed partial fingerprints on the locket, belonging to none other than Robert Hensley, the same maintenance worker cleared 2 decades earlier. Hensley, now 65, lived quietly in Murfreesboro. When detectives arrived to question him, he looked stunned but calm. "I already told you people everything," he said. "I didn't touch that girl." When shown the photo of the locket, he stared at it for a long moment before saying, "I gave that to her mother after the recital. It must have got mixed up somehow." But that wasn't true. Margaret Carver confirmed she'd never received any locket. As the case deepened, Whitaker began reconstructing the night of the recital. Church records showed that Hensley had indeed been scheduled off that weekend, but phone records from 2004 revealed a call from the church landline to his home that evening at 7:14 p.m. It lasted only 2 minutes. When questioned, he couldn't explain it. Then came the piano technician's report. Beneath the keys, lodged between the soundboard and the frame, were traces of dark brown residue, blood that had soaked into the wood and dried. Forensic testing confirmed it was human, female, and a familial match to Margaret Carver. The discovery stunned even veteran investigators. For 20 years, the piano had sat in silence, holding its secret. Now it was speaking. Whitaker returned to the farmhouse one evening after the lab results came in. The sun was setting over the Tennessee hills, painting the cracked windows gold. Inside, the air smelled of varnish and dust. She sat at the piano bench and pressed one of the keys. The note rang sharp, flat from age. For a moment, she thought she could hear something beneath the sound. A faint echo, like the whisper of a voice. She was right. The same words from the note. She pulled out her recorder and dictated quietly. "Evidence suggests the victim may have been moved from the church to this location. Piano possibly used to conceal evidence. Further excavation pending." Her voice trembled only slightly. Back at headquarters, she and her team combed through 2004 property records, looking for any connection between Hensley and the farmhouse. There was none, until they discovered an obscure maintenance invoice from March 2004. A plumbing repair, signed by Hensley himself, billed to a private client at that same address. He had been there. The next morning, they obtained a search warrant for Hensley's property in Murfreesboro. In his garage, tucked inside a wooden box of old tools, they found a collection of cassette tapes labeled Choir Practice 04, Easter Rehearsal, and Lacey. The tapes were brittle with age, but one still played. Static filled the air, followed by faint music, a piano melody, hesitant and soft, then a voice, a woman's. "Mr. Hensley, I don't think this is right," she said. A pause. "Please don't—" The rest was drowned out by distortion. When the recording stopped, the room was silent. Whitaker took off her headphones, staring into space. It was the first time anyone had heard Lacey's voice in 20 years. The TBI processed the tapes and determined that portions had been erased and recorded over multiple times. But the background acoustics, faint echoes, water dripping, creaking wood, matched the acoustics of the farmhouse basement. That was enough for a search warrant. 2 days later, forensic teams began excavating the cellar of the farmhouse. Beneath a layer of dirt and crumbled plaster, they found fragments of a wooden crate. Inside were personal effects: a broken hair clip, a shoe, and remnants of a blue dress. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Lacey Carver. When confronted with the evidence, Hensley's demeanor cracked. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he said quietly during interrogation. "She just wanted to leave. She said she'd tell." His eyes went distant. "She shouldn't have come back." He confessed to luring her to the farmhouse that night under the pretense of moving some music equipment from the church. When she resisted his advances, he struck her. Panicking, he hid her body inside the piano's bass, intending to move it later. But he never did. The silence that followed his confession was heavy. Even the air in the room seemed to stop moving. When the case finally broke in the news, it gripped Tennessee. "Justice after 20 years," one headline read. Margaret Carver stood outside the courthouse the day Hensley was charged with second-degree murder. Her voice shook as she spoke to reporters. "I prayed every night she'd come home. I guess now she finally has." That night, Whitaker sat alone in her office, listening again to the tape labeled Lacey. As the faint notes of piano filled the room, she felt tears rise unbidden. Justice was done, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a song ending on the wrong chord. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she thought she could still hear Lacey playing somewhere in the distance, soft, hesitant, the sound of a soul finally being heard after 20 long years. And the note, dated March 4th, 2004, lay in an evidence bag beside her, silent again. But one question remained. Who had written it? The handwriting didn't match Hensley's. For a week after the arrest, Franklin felt quieter than usual. The town, which had spent 2 decades living with unanswered questions, seemed to be holding its breath. But Detective Whitaker couldn't rest. She'd spent too many years watching cases collapse because of overlooked details, and one detail refused to leave her mind. The note. The way it was written, hurried, emotional, yet articulate, didn't match Hensley's tone at all. He'd admitted to the assault and the concealment, but he denied ever writing anything or placing it inside the piano. At first the lab brushed it off, assuming he was lying, but when handwriting analysis came back, the results confirmed Whitaker's hunch. The note hadn't been written by Hensley. It was female handwriting. That revelation pulled her back to the beginning. Who else could have known about the farmhouse, the piano, and that night? The first step was to go through Lacey's old circle again. Teachers, colleagues, friends. One name jumped out from an old file. Emily Rowe. Emily was the niece of Edna Rowe, the retired music teacher who'd owned the farmhouse. In 2004, she'd been 19, one of Lacey's piano students. She'd given a short statement back then, said she saw Lacey leave the church after the recital and assumed she was heading home. But there were inconsistencies in her timeline. She claimed to have gone straight home afterward. Yet, Her car had been spotted near the farmhouse on a traffic camera at 9:07 p.m. The police in 2004 dismissed it as coincidence. Emily's family owned that property. But now, with new evidence, Whitaker couldn't ignore it. When she found Emily 20 years later, she was a music therapist living in Nashville. Married, 2 children, quiet life. Whitaker visited her home, careful with her tone. "You studied under Lacey, didn't you?" Emily smiled faintly. "She was my first real mentor. She was kind, patient. Everyone loved her." "Do you remember the night she disappeared?" Her smile faltered. "I remember the music. I stayed late after the recital to help clean up. She said she'd stop by my aunt's house later that week to pick up some sheet music, but she never came." Whitaker set the evidence bag containing the note on the table. "Does this handwriting look familiar?" Emily stared at it, her hands clasping tightly. "Where did you find that?" "Inside the piano at your aunt's house." For a moment, Emily said nothing. Then, barely audible, "I thought it was gone." Whitaker leaned forward. "You wrote it?" Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Not that night. Months later. I found something in the basement after Aunt Edna died. I didn't know what to do. There was a smell, and I thought maybe an animal had crawled under the floorboards. When I pulled up one of the panels, I saw the piano wires twisted around something. Fabric. I panicked. I thought it was part of a rug, but then..." Her voice cracked. "Then I saw the hair." Whitaker listened silently, her chest tight. "I didn't know who to call," Emily continued. "My aunt was gone. The house was about to be sold. I just wrote that note and hid it in the piano. I didn't have the courage to tell anyone. Why didn't you come forward later?" Emily looked at her with hollow eyes. "Because by the time I realized it might have been Lacey, the police had already closed the case. I thought I'd imagined it. I was 19. I was terrified. I thought if I said something, they'd think I was crazy." Her confession filled in a blank that had haunted the file for years. The note wasn't a killer's message. It was a witness's silent plea. Someone who'd stumbled into truth and couldn't face it. Whitaker thanked her quietly and promised confidentiality until the case was formally closed. But even with that peace in place, something still felt incomplete. The timeline didn't fit. Hensley had confessed to the killing and hiding Lacey's body, but forensic analysis showed the blood inside the piano came from 2 separate events, one consistent with an assault, another weeks later, as if someone had opened the piano again after she was already gone. When the forensic reconstruction team examined the damage pattern on the piano's wood, they discovered a set of smaller, more delicate fingerprints overlapping Hensley's. They belonged to Lacey herself. That detail changed everything. Whitaker began to suspect that the original story wasn't exactly as Hensley remembered, so she requested psychological reevaluation of his statements. The TBI's profiler pointed out the inconsistencies. He describes hitting her and panicking, but there's no evidence of blunt trauma on the recovered fragments of bone. There is, however, a clear sign of suffocation. Controlled, methodical. That's not panic. That's intent. In light of the new findings, Whitaker decided to revisit one of the lesser-known figures in the case, Pastor Raymond Cole, who had been leading the church back in 2004. He'd been one of the first to report Lacey missing. According to old transcripts, he said she was struggling spiritually and needed time away. Those phrases now sounded rehearsed. Cole had retired and moved to Chattanooga. When Whitaker met him, he was 76, frail but lucid. At first he seemed eager to talk. "I prayed for that girl for years," he said. "Such talent, such promise." "Did you know Robert Hensley well?" Whitaker asked. The pastor hesitated. He did repairs around the church, kept to himself. "Quiet man. Did you know about the farmhouse connection?" He blinked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What connection?" "The property belonged to Edna Rowe, one of your parishioners. Records show you signed off on a maintenance invoice she submitted, Hensley's name on it." He looked away. "That was years ago. I can't recall." But Whitaker saw his hands tremble. She recognized that tremor, the physical manifestation of fear disguised as memory lapse. She decided to press further. "Pastor, was there ever any reason for Lacey to meet with you outside church hours?" He hesitated again, then shook his head. "Not that I recall." When she slid a copy of the invoice toward him, the color drained from his face. "That's not my signature," he whispered. Handwriting analysis would later confirm it was forged by Hensley. Back at the precinct, Whitaker pinned a new photo on the evidence board. Hensley, Lacey, the farmhouse, and now Emily Rowe's note. 4 names, 4 points in a web that finally made sense. She began laying out the timeline. Lacey leaves the recital at 8:30 p.m. She likely drove to the farmhouse voluntarily, believing she was meeting Hensley to collect instruments borrowed for the church choir. Something happens. An argument, perhaps, leading to her death. He hides the body inside the piano, too scared to dispose of it elsewhere. Weeks later, he's called back by Edna Rowe to fix a broken pipe. While there, he reseals the piano, ensuring no trace remains. Then Edna dies in 2009, and the secret sleeps until Emily discovers it years later. Simple, tidy. But Whitaker knew cases like this rarely ended neatly. That night, she sat alone in the precinct evidence room. The cassette tapes recovered from Hensley's garage had been transferred to digital format, and she decided to listen again, this time with headphones and no distractions. Halfway through the choir practice tape, she heard something new. A voice in the background, not Hensley's, not Lacey's. A woman humming, off-key but familiar. Whitaker replayed it several times, isolating the frequency. When she matched the hum against archived recordings of Edna Rowe's old recitals, the pattern aligned. Edna had been there that night. That changed everything again. She requested access to Edna Rowe's death certificate and property records. The coroner's report listed natural causes, but the file contained an odd note from the attending physician. Patient exhibited confusion in final weeks. Claimed to hear piano music at night. If Edna had heard the music, it meant she'd discovered something. And if she'd confronted Hensley, perhaps the old woman's sudden illness wasn't natural after all. But toxicology had never been performed. Too late now. Still, Whitaker felt she was standing at the edge of truth. The following morning, she visited Margaret Carver once more. The elderly woman sat on her porch, a cup of tea trembling in her hand. "You found the man who did it," Margaret said softly. "But I can see in your face there's more." Whitaker hesitated, then nodded. "We think others might have known. We're still piecing it together." Margaret's gaze drifted toward the horizon. "Lacey always said people don't listen until you make them hear. She used to practice until the whole house shook. Maybe that's her way of still being heard." When Whitaker left, the sound of a piano drifted from a nearby open window, just scales, someone practicing. But for a fleeting second, it made her skin prickle. 2 weeks later, the district attorney called. Hensley had taken a plea deal to avoid a full trial. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, but before sentencing, he requested to speak privately with Whitaker. The meeting took place in a small interview room at the county jail. Hensley looked smaller than before, shoulders hunched, hands folded. "I didn't write that note," he began. "I know," she said. He looked up sharply. "Then you know she wasn't alone." "Who?" "Your witness, the Rowe girl. She wasn't the first to see. Edna saw too. She begged me to move the piano out of the house, said it was cursed, said she could hear her student playing inside, but I couldn't risk it. I thought if I just left it, the sound would stop. But it never did." Whitaker studied him. His eyes were clear, almost eerily calm. "Do you believe that?" she asked quietly. He nodded. "You'll believe it too, Detective. Next time you hear a piano and there's no one around, you'll think of her." He smiled faintly, and the guard led him away. When she returned to the station, she sat down at her desk and reviewed the final report for the district attorney. Everything tied together. Everything but the unexplainable. The music, the note, the timing. 3 days later, before the farmhouse was scheduled for demolition, Whitaker drove out there one last time. She wanted closure. Something physical. Something she could see and touch to remind herself the case was over. The piano had already been moved to an evidence facility, leaving behind only a rectangular mark on the wooden floor. She stood in the empty room, the winter light slanting through cracked glass. Her footsteps echoed softly. For a moment, the stillness pressed against her. And then, faintly, she heard it. One note. A single, low piano key. It could have been the wind. It could have been memory. But she found herself whispering aloud. We listened. Outside, the demolition crew idled their trucks, waiting for clearance. Whitaker handed the foreman the signed release and watched as they began tearing down the old farmhouse. The walls fell in sections, dust rising like smoke. Later, when she drove away, she passed the Carver house one last time. In the window, she saw Margaret sitting at a small keyboard, her hands resting on the keys, but not playing. The air shimmered with late afternoon light. By the time Whitaker reached the edge of town, she realized she could still hear faint music on the breeze. Soft, distant, and almost peaceful. She didn't look back. In her final report, she wrote, "Case closed. Primary suspect deceased in custody. Secondary witness statements verified. Evidence recovered. Motive established." But beneath that, she added one more line, something not for the record. The piano kept her voice until someone finally listened. That night, as rain began to fall over Franklin, the sound of thunder rolled through the hills. In the courthouse evidence room, under flickering fluorescent lights, the old piano sat covered in plastic. And for just an instant, a single key moved on its own.